today is presented by Chris Pascuzzi and Dr. Michael Rowe from Torrens University. Chris Pascuzzi is Business Development Manager at Torrens University. His previous experiences include senior roles in state government. He has been learning and development consultant across 2 universities for over a decade. His corporate experience includes many years training managers and leaders in the automotive industry across a variety of major brands. Joining Chris is Dr. Michael Rowe as a senior lecturer at Torrens University, a business consultant, facilitator and coach. He has significant mid and senior executive experience in corporate and government, and his research interests are focused on improving business performance. So please welcome Chris and Michael.
A couple of, qualifiers for the session. Neither Michael or I are certified in GNOS, but we're familiar with the model. And what we're presenting today, to provide the context, was that we were asked by Rob and Wendy to maybe step in and provide something that would complement a coaching session. And it seems to me that if you're a coach, one of the things that are really important to you as part of your repertoire is that you've got a good antenna around emotional intelligence. How many people sort of get a sense of what emotional intelligence is? Most of you are pretty aware of what we're talking about. So this is not about giving you the 101 of EI, but what I think is important is that the university is trying to build capability in our students where they'll be able to join organisations with insight about themselves and how they work in a team and how they can be empowered, how they can be part of it. And so those soft skills become part of the things that we're really gravitating towards as an education facility, because we know it's critically important for people when they venture out into the workforce. And we've got international students who aren't all that familiar with working in Australia and their culture, etc. So we've embedded the GNOS self-report, which all of you have done, as part of their both undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications. Right? So we take them through the self-report, we get them to reflect on that report and the outcomes that are actually, reflected about their answers. So what I can tell you is that this afternoon is really just a toe in the water. If you're not familiar with, how many of you are familiar with GNOS as a company? Okay, a little bit of a back narrative around it. It started at Swinburne Uni about nearly 20 years ago now, and it was Dr. Ben Palmer and Professor Con Stow, and they developed this instrument where they would assess for sort of capability or competencies, if you like, around emotional intelligence. And we'll take you through that because you've been aware of what those characteristics are by doing that self-report. So GNOS was born, and it's become a global company, and to the extent that it's rated in the top 20 instruments globally, and it's been that way for at least the last decade. And Ben Palmer was to be here today to run this session. That's who I recommended Rob use, because Ben's just fabulous and works with a lot of major brands, and his company now, because it's global, has a global reach. So they're into China, they're into Europe, they're into the UK, US, and the South Americas. And so what we'll take you through is, if you like, is to reflect on the reports that you've actually generated. How many of you had time to have a look at those reports? Okay. How accessible was the information? Just a little bit of feedback. Was it a reasonable activity to do, and did you get anything out of it? Just a quick reflection on it. We'll dive into it a little bit deeper, but a quick reflection. Was it useful?
Once we learn how to interpret it, we'll be able to answer that question.
Yeah, okay.
It was very simple to use.
Yeah.
It was fast, efficient, emailed straight into my inbox, no problem.
Okay. So effectively, it's a self-report, and it's just measuring two elements. One is the behaviour. Do you think it's an important piece that you know, in terms of the capability that you're talking about. Is it important? And then how much do you demonstrate it? So I think it's a useful, I guess, construction, because it's about what you're feeling, if you like, about the question. Okay? That's a self-report. The other reports that GNOS can do are the 180s and 360s, and I think most of you would be familiar with that. So that's where the real proof in the pudding is when you start getting feedback from either your direct reports, your peers, or your boss. So fundamental to the self-report is self-awareness. And then what we'll do is Mike will take you through and talk a little bit more about the report and what it's actually investigating. And I think what we'd like to leave you with is this question of, if you've drawn any insight from either the session this afternoon and or by going back to your report with a different lens, then what would you do differently? So hopefully we'll get a little bit of a coaching moment where, you know, you'll be energised and you'll go back to it with some motivation to understand it better. But it's only your perceptions, if you like, measured against a sort of global body of respondents right across the globe. So we're going to use a little activity just to get us to focus a little bit about emotions. Now, using that device,
Mentimeter.
thank you. Just start thinking about what in the last 24 hours. I've had a resignation in Sydney that left me with major depression because she was one of my star workers, right? So, but I want you to think about what emotions and the range of emotions you've had, and maybe, you know, they might be positive, they might be negative, they may have fluctuated over the 24 hours. Okay, just focus on those feelings that are being nominated up there. And for the person that wrote happy, then think about the impact that had on your behaviour and the way you're relating to other people. The person's just written overwhelmed. What was that doing? What was that impacting on your own behaviour, your own personality, and how you were relating to others? Stressed. So it's really important, I think, when we start talking about emotional intelligence, we just sort of somehow come back and anchor on ourselves in terms of what we're actually feeling that may impact on our behaviour. And to be emotionally intelligent is to be able to be aware of when I am stressed so that I'm not impacting on someone else as a stress case. Because that only just handle the stress to someone else. So if you struggle with words and language, and this is when we do, people do GNOS training, we get people to focus on this list. And this is only, I'm sure, just again, the tip of the iceberg.
I think I had all of those just last night. Those kids for you.
They are.
Suicidal's there. Spunky's there. So I think what we're trying to do is get you to think of the whole idea of what emotions do in terms of this activity. So just think about that exercise you've just done. If you're talking about positive and negative, right, in terms of that balance. Reflect on the fact of how much positivity you may have been feeling in the last 24 hours and what's that? The others have been mentioning negative terms, negative feelings. What impact has that been having on you? Having on your relationships, and how it's impacting on your behaviour. And then think about it from the point of view of people that are around you, part of your team. And part of this activity is really about being aware of other people's emotions. It's critically important if you're working with them, working alongside of them, that you know if they're in a productive state. If they're not in a productive state, it's feasible that some of the negative emotions may be impacting on them, that's impairing their performance. So I'll hand over to Mike, because Mike will now take us through, but I think what I want to ground us on is that the sense of when you look at your self-report and you think about where the discrepancies are between the things that you think are really important versus how well you think you demonstrate them. And therein lies an opportunity for you to adjust the way you're behaving and operating and thinking and feeling, because emotions will influence your decisions. As I said to you, I went into a slight depression because I lost a worker, and I thought, can I do this? Can I rebuild it? Can I hire someone that can take her place? All of those things are affecting me as the way I'm feeling and my decisions today. And so then I was gearing up for this. And so I didn't want it to impact on my performance today. Why? Because there's a long game. I'll rehire, we'll train, and we'll bring someone on the team, hopefully, that we can grow to the capability we had with this person that we'd spent a couple of years developing. So I'll hand over to Mike to start. He'll take us through the actual instrument itself, and he'll talk a little bit more about this, the science of emotions. Okay?
Thanks, Chris. I was getting really used to you presenting. I was sitting back enjoying it, and now it's my turn. So that list of emotions that we saw earlier I thought was really interesting as well, because when I thought back over the last 24 hours, I was just joking. I hadn't experienced all of those emotions. I could name about 2 or 3, and they were pretty kind of fundamental emotions, but the fact is all of our lives have a lot of emotional input all the time that we're aware of to a greater or lesser extent, mainly a lesser extent. And so the question becomes, are we controlling our responses to these emotional inputs, or are they controlling our responses to them? So what this slide here is saying is that there's an event that will happen, and we interpret it through 2 different parts of our brain. We've got the primitive brain, which is very reactive, and then we've got the thinking brain, if you like, which takes a more nuanced approach. But the emotional brain is basically looking at it and saying, is this an opportunity as a threat, or is this a threat? Is this something that's good, or is this something that's bad? And as we know, depending on our own personal circumstances, the same set of events could be confronting or amusing, for example. So this is a question of interpretation. If we see it as being useful, then we feel satisfied. We feel like we're meaningful, that we're valued, and what we do is useful. And that triggers a response in the thinking brain that enables us to be lateral and creative and engaged and calm and all those sorts of things. If our emotional brain interprets an event as being not useful or being threatening in some ways, then we tend to close down. We become defensive. We lack confidence. And so our thinking brain interprets that and limits our ability to respond or our engagement. We become disengaged. We become disempowered. So what's happening here is, to an extent, if we're self-aware, or if we understand the role of emotions, if we're able to recognize them as they come through and deal with them in an intelligent way, means that we can end up employing the right part of our thinking brain. We make better decisions and we demonstrate better behaviours, which is where we all want to be, because we know these decisions, behaviours impact on our performance. And I'm sure we've got experience when we think back over situations we've been in the past where people have taken something the wrong way, or they've lost control of their emotions, or they've become overly responsive in a way that was unexpected, unanticipated, often the outcomes aren't what we want them to be. So understanding that there's this thing that's happening there in the background, critically important. So GNOS came up with this model, which balances out the various competencies that are required, that the research tells us are required in order to be emotionally intelligent and to get the benefits from doing that. So the way we represent that is through these 6 competencies, which you would be aware of. And it's interesting to reflect on these just in isolation. So our self-awareness, okay, well, what does that mean? Are we conscious of what's motivating our behaviour? Are we conscious of what's informing our decision-making? Awareness of others. And in the classic sort of Goldman emotional intelligence model, or when we think of the Johari window, perhaps, if people have gone in that direction, when there's a transaction happening, there are 2 people in that transaction and both of them have perspectives. If those perspectives align, if others are perceiving me the way I want them to perceive me, then we're all great. But where our awareness of others is lacking and we're not reading the signals that are coming back, or we're not truly tuned into what's happening in the dynamic of that moment, we can get ourselves into trouble. Authenticity. I teach a leadership class here, and it's all based around authentic leadership. It's all based around values that are inherent to the individual. We all have different values, and the extent to which we're able to bring those values into our life on a daily basis. So authenticity is really being driven by your own values, by who you actually are. And there are some sort of approaches to leadership that say we take the person and then we build up, leadership behaviours on top of that, and that makes them a leader. We prefer to think that you start with the person and you strip away until you get to the essence of what drives that person, what's important to that person, and that's where the leadership springs from. So authenticity, very important. Emotional reasoning, obviously very important. Our ability to self-manage, and the fact that we can become a positive influence. So if we're in an unproductive state here, if we're viewing things as threats and negatives and so on, we find ourselves disconnected, insensitive when dealing with other people. We become, or we're perceived as, untrustworthy. Our approach to emotional leadership is quite limited and constrained. We're temperamental and indifferent. That again, I think I was all of those things just yesterday, but then I do have young kids, so that's fair enough. If we go at the other end, if we're empowered in each of these competencies, well then we're present instead of disconnected. We're in the moment, which is a great place to be. We're empathetic. We can put ourselves in the shoes of the other person, and we're therefore able to mediate better outcomes. We're genuine in our approach to interpersonal dynamics. We're expansive in our emotional reasoning, resilient in the face of all of the challenges that come our way rather than temperamental. And as far as other people are concerned, we're empowering to them. We're not kind of threatened by them. We're able to deal with them in a very open and transparent way. So clearly, if we're on the right-hand side of this equation, then we're doing much better than if we're on the left-hand side of the equation. We get ourselves on that right-hand side by understanding our emotional responses on each of these dimensions. So you will have got the report. We won't do this just now, but the report is a really important starting point for an exploration of emotional intelligence. So this isn't giving you all of the answers and you follow the 6 steps and you're going to be amazing people. This is an invitation to consider this set of data. In fact, when we do this in the classroom, we say to the students, we pair them up so they can go and mentor each other and explore each other's lives. We get them to do other psychometric tests online, and most importantly, we get them to reflect on their leadership background and where they want to go in the future and try and make sense of it. So we get them to explore 3 different sets of data: interpersonal data, personal reflection, and what the testing is showing them. And so that's, when we talk about this stuff, that's the starting point. This gives you something to think about upon reflection. You can say, well, if I've got a deficiency somewhere, if my lines don't kind of line up, where have I seen that in my behaviour in the past? Where have I seen, or where have I encountered issues that at the time I kind of didn't really understand? Why isn't this working? Or why am I unable to be productive? Now, we ask you here to identify the 3 most important, and we'll look at the traffic light section that enables us to do that In the meantime, this is what I'm saying, results don't reflect your actual EQ or innate level of emotional intelligence. And there are other factors that come into play when you're considering this, because, well, there are a range of things that impact on us. Things like, the opportunity that we're pursuing. If this is a high stakes opportunity, it's going to change our response because there's more at stake here. Our personal context. There are times in our life when we're under pressure. There are other times in our life when we're pretty cruisy. So, we can encounter the same set of circumstances and be in one frame of mind and respond to it very differently to if we're in another frame of mind. The culture that we come from, culture is absolutely fascinating, and it can be the organisational culture in which these transactions take place, or it can be even our national culture of origin. So, cultures like the water that a fish swims in, we're not aware of it until we find ourselves in a different culture, and then we can do the compare and contrast. But different cultures will have different responses to, or typically different responses to different circumstances. The nature-nurture thing is our composition, our family of origin, what we've experienced and how that has changed us as we've grown up, what's motivating us, and then how we handle relationships. So we start with the competencies, but all of these factors can moderate what those competencies are telling us, which is why I'm saying this isn't straightforward and we're not giving you all the answers, but we're giving you a starting point to really explore in your own way what's driving the behaviours. So as you're aware of here, is this a laser? Yeah, it is. Cool. So we've got the two different levels here. Level of importance, so that's how important you report that each of these competencies is to you. And this is the level at which it is demonstrated. And as you can see, that little rectangle there represents the upper and lower bounds of the top 50% of responses, middle 50% of responses that GNOS have accumulated over the 20 years they've been doing this. And so obviously if something is very important to you but your level of demonstration is lower, that represents an opportunity for you to work on that dimension. And similarly, if you're below the 50% mark here, then you might say to yourself, oh, that's really interesting. Does it make you a bad person, ineffective person, or flawed in some way? No, it's just that's your composition. And so the great news is that you're able to, once you become aware that there's an issue, then you're able to start addressing that issue. This is the traffic light report that you get, which makes it easy at a glance to figure out what's going on. So this is for the authenticity competency, and it's broken down into a series of subpoints or attitudes, behaviours, and so on. And the gap, so here if we take the first one, for example, importance is 5, demonstrated 3.8, gap therefore, the difference of 1.2, it's a negative difference, and so because it's significant, it's coming up as that should be a red. This is where you are relative to the benchmarks. And this enables you to prioritise. Obviously, if some things are green, then that's interesting, and let's move on to something where there's somewhere where we can make an improvement. So it's a starting point for prioritising what you do going forward. This is the report that we've seen, so we don't need to talk about this in great detail, but it does have a series of generic approaches or generic points of interest around each of those competencies, and I ask you to make sure that you read those. This is interesting because when you look at your results, it's like the first question, well, how do I make sense of this? Because there's a lot of information there, and it's best to revisit it over a period of time. But as a way of thinking about it, there are, in that top quadrant, there are things that you'll see there and they'll be completely expected. And you'll go, well, that's not a surprise. It's very clear, that's fine. So they're the ones that we put out of our minds because they're going to happen anyway. The surprise quadrant is interesting because they're things that you didn't expect. But in retrospect, you can look back and go, okay, I see why that could be there. So that might be a variance in who I thought I was or the behaviours I thought I was demonstrating, but okay, I get that. This is the one that's interesting down here. Things that are a surprise to you and aren't clear. And oftentimes, if we think back for those of you that are aware of the Johari window, this is things that people see in us that we don't see in ourselves. That's the great area of opportunity. And from there, questions and actions. So we start asking, well, why is this happening, or how might this demonstrate itself in a relationship with a person or a job or whatever, and then what can I do to address that? So I think I hand back to Chris now. That's just a rough overview, but hopefully some things to think about, and Chris will take you from here.
Sorry, just a question. There was no rectangle for the level of importance. Level of importance continuum. There was no rectangle for that 50% average.
There wasn't?
No, there is for level of demonstration, but not level of demonstration.
Yeah, well, because it's the importance that you put on it.
Yeah, I was going to say,
rather than what all of you are sort of, the pool of people that demonstrate that behaviour is captured. The importance is sort of like a relative judgment that you put on it, basically. So, is it feasible that we can run this activity that you feel confident enough to, and maybe what we'll do is use the technology, if we can. Are you able to reflect back on your report and then put up through the...
We haven't put a Vegimeter up for this, have we?
Yeah.
Oh, we have. Oh,
Yeah. So this is a way, when we normally say we'll turn to the person next to you and share, this is a way of general sharing with the whole group. And this is about your personal, if you like, surprise about your results.
While they come up, I would think the surprises are going to be forthcoming if it was a 360-degree feedback, right? Because I put something up and I said, this is really important, it's 5. And I rate myself 4. Well, it's not a surprise to me that it came up on a... Where is the surprise? Is it where the broader responses are over 20 years of data to say, I was actually higher than a lot of other people or lower than a lot of other people already? That's where we're going to, right?
Yeah, I think so. What we are recommending is that the 180 and the 360 reports, in fact, are a lot more instructive because they give you feedback.
Yes.
Right? Because the 180s would say to you, well, my direct reports and my peers really think this is important, and Chris, this is how well you demonstrate it. Right, so that's a really strong message, but enables you to do something about it. And so if you, I suppose you can talk to GNOS and practitioners who do the EI development work, the leadership work, given the insight that you gain from that feedback, I think taking the coaching approach is that it gives you that opportunity to do something about it. If your team are saying to you, Chris, we need to see more of this, we really value, the piece of behaviour that is part of the element of, say, authenticity, or the awareness of others. There's issues in there around empathy and so on. It's really important to get that feedback, right? Because that enables you to become a more effective leader.
But also in that, even in the self-assessment one, for each of those competencies, there's 8 or 10 or 12 attributes. And so you might do really well, so you've got green traffic lights on some of them and red traffic lights on others. So within the competency, there are going to be surprises there.
Right.
Okay, so again, self-report is relatively benign, right? It is simply raising your awareness to some of the elements that contribute. It's frightening. And if you do need help, that's a great connection to have made, is it not? And a lot of the other EI instruments are relatively the same. They measure much the same level of competencies if you like, or capabilities. The reason I like GNOS is it's pretty accessible. It doesn't actually turn you inside out, but it does give you a reasonable floor plan in terms of, you know, about being aware, about how to manage other people, etc.
Would have been good to do it every 10 years, Chris, just to see how much we change in middle wisdom. Because I'm sure that when we were the age of young Lockie here, we were quite bullish about what we were doing in our lives. Where a few years on, things are really changing, what we expect.
Yeah,
Trying to go fishing at the
but if you're new to leading and new to managing people, you know, there is a growth curve, right? You don't have the silver bullet, you don't have the repertoire to be able to handle, you know, the sort of coaching moments that we just went through earlier today. You know, that's a very poised and a purposeful approach to handling that level of conversation. Because I know, as a manager in the old days, I would move into that telling people what to do, and you know that when you start telling people what to do, the monkey jumps from there back onto yours. So there's no gain. So the issue is really about how you can be aware of others and maybe work through some of that nurturing and work through a coaching approach to ensure that you've got them engaged and you've got them motivated and energised. But a lot of that will start with you and end with you, right? Because it's about your self-awareness. Are we done?
So sorry, just building on that last question, it's a very similar thought to that. But you know, in the second question, which asks you to rank your own demonstration of those behaviours, you know, against what is the average that you see around you, I found myself thinking, well, if I compare myself to some junior colleagues, it would be this score, but senior colleagues, is it inferred in that question that you should be comparing yourself against your peers? Because otherwise you could have a range of results, because of course as we, I think most of us recognise, emotional intelligence develops throughout your career. So should you answer that question by choosing some examples of peers and actually rank yourself against only your peers?
Well, I think it's got to start and end with self. I think the others are maybe benchmarked, if you like, what's happening in the culture that you're in. But in effect, it's a question of what you're prepared to, your insight, your growth, your opportunity and development. So it really is about you being comfortable rating yourself where you think you need to be. With the other instruments though, you get that direct feedback that validates or not where you've rated yourself. You might say, I'm a 4 out of 5 on this. Yet all your direct reports might say, well, Chris, you're actually a 3. And yet your peers might think you're doing really well and put you higher than where you think you are. So I think the value of these sorts of instruments are really about your opportunity for insight and development. So that's what I get out of these, doing these self-reports, if you like. But when I did the 360, that's when it really drove it home, because then you know the impact you're having on people who are reporting to you. You've got your peers there who, you know, you might have good raters, good mates, you know, they'll say, oh, Chris is great. And yet your boss says, well, you rate yourself a 5, I see you at a 3. That starts in that opportunity for a coaching conversation, but it's about real connection at that point. So I think look, the 360s are intrusive. All of you who may have done one will know that it's asking people to come forward with a definitive point of view on those sorts of elements. And I think that can be confronting. And I've worked with a client that had a leadership group that weren't functioning all that well. And he took them through a GNOS program. And it was interesting because half the way through, one person said, well, I know who rated me this, and it was the HR director, and she commissioned the work. And the reality was, it wasn't her, it was the boss. And so it really dawned on him that there was dissonance there and it had never really been confronted. So it became quite an intervention, and so at the end of the day, I think 2 or 3 of the people in that executive group resigned and left. Now, it's not about flushing out performance, but it is about having real conversations, right? And
that highlights there's a big gulf between the self-assessment and the 360 degree.
I absolutely, because you're just rating yourself, and how do I feel today? I'm feeling pretty good. I think I did this really well. So,
Chris, can I ask you a question? When you did this with students, how different is it to the results that you get from a group with our level of maturity? I don't want to say we're all, but you all do. Is there a difference? How do the students?
the self-report tends to be used with just people in the workplace to raise awareness around EI and potentially to get them start thinking about the impact they might be having on other people and the potential for them to be more productive, if you like, in the workplace, being mindful of some of these aspects. Right? So students are a little bit like omnivores. They don't know what they don't know. So for them, this is opening up ideas and thoughts that they probably haven't been exposed to before. For leadership groups, management groups, then you move into that 180 or a 360, but needs to be done with a certified practitioner. You need a proper certified EI coach who can take you through a personal 360 debrief. And the debriefs normally take about 2 hours, right? And so a lot of people get dissonance when they get rated by someone who they, well, rated from an area that they weren't expecting the feedback. So just, okay.
But actually, Peter, that's an interesting question. We see some reporting, but we don't see aggregate reporting of students versus. But it's something that we should probably kind of ask for. I'm sure it's been used for research. I'm sure there's lots of interesting data that they could pull out. So I hadn't really considered that before, but it also addresses the question: how do we change over time? It would be interesting because you know that some of those bars are going to get longer and some of them are going to get shorter. Because perhaps over time, as you achieve success, you know, you're more self-confident than you may have been otherwise, and so that's going to make something less less positive. But I might ask him the question and see if there's any research or if there's data available.
I find it interesting because Pascal said, our emotional resilience gets better as we get older. Maybe not in all cases, but when you see, graduates coming out into the workforce, they really need a lot of help in this space.
Yeah.
And so I would think they're quite different to what we would come up with. We'd probably all rate ourselves relatively highly.
Just the nature of how it's measured, I'm not sure you'd be able to track the difference because at that moment in time, as a student, I might put myself at 5 and put it at 4 because I don't know what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then as at my age, which we're going to,
Yeah.
I probably do exactly the same. I'm still going 5 and 4.
I'm really good at this.
I'm really because I'm going 4 and 3. I haven't changed where it is. It's just my perception of the world and what I know is different because you're actually using exactly the same measure. And that first one is how do I feel about it right now? So,
But I could imagine a situation where somebody goes into a role and they're straight out of uni and they're not well formed, and so they have a certain kind of approach. But then over the course of their employment, they get rewarded for some behaviours and punished for others. And let's say they get rewarded for behaviours where they're the boss, they've got the right answers, they push sales teams, they're always right. I don't have to listen to you because look at where I've got to. Under those circumstances, they could test really differently because of the experiences they've had.
well, thanks. It's more. I think I'm more talking with regards to how it's measured.
Here's some information.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Siri's going to help.
Because of
Oh, okay, so you'd say that you'd rate it.
I still put the rating exactly the same.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just the different factors that's influenced it, just different, which you haven't measured the factors, you just measured that particular moment in time where it's set, and I still look at it the same way. And I'm not articulating it's really bad.
There's a, no, you're not, but I'm starting to think there's a really good research paper in this.
There's a generational difference though, because, you know, Chris, you were saying, coaches said, well, I rate you as a 3. You might have got a completely different reaction from a Gen Z who would have said, well, fuck you, you know, well, how come you judge me like that? And then you're off on a different tangent, right? So it's not always the same, and they're quite self-righteous in what they think, because they're a generation coming up, and you're saying, well, if I look at the baby boomers, have you done that well? No, so I'm just saying that it's a really interesting opportunity to check the difference between the generations and how they actually see this stuff. They might not
Sorry, can I add something?
Yeah,
Sorry,
fine.
I'm accredited in a emotional intelligence tool, not this one, but another one. And as part of the research of actually being accredited, it does show that emotional intelligence actually increases up to about the age of 50, then it actually goes down. Yeah. Sorry.
Can I just share, I finally got my bloody thing open. Michael, in terms of what you put up there, we call that a traffic light report. Right? So green means that's great, I'm going okay. Amber, hang in there, I'm looking for the red lights, right? So I'm happy to put in here that my issue, and I say it out loud because I'm interested in those that know me quite well, is around, I'm happy to tell people how I feel, but I don't get too much about how they feel when I'm telling them, and it's a real highlight here for me, is that I've got it off my chest, but now the problem's over to you. You know what I mean? So that's telling me, it's not all about me, it's actually about the other person who's listening. Lockie, if you could take this back to your mother, please. And I'm waiting for Jamie to come up with something smart. Sorry, Jamie.
I was just ask what the heading is. The heading, what you're talking about.
I know, so there's self-awareness, authenticity, because badge of honour is I'll just tell you exactly what I'm thinking, how I feel, and that's the Dutch in me, but that comes at a cost, right? I have to pull my head in. I'm sorry, Jamie, for everything I've ever said. I'm sorry for all that you did.
And can I maybe preface the GNOS can give you composite reports, for example. I know they can do that. And the other thing, they do run programs, and I'm familiar with a couple of them, and they tend to run maybe over about a 5 or a 6 month window. And the way they operate is they do a pre-workshop assessment, and then they do one afterwards to see if there's any shift in the dial. Because my presumption is they take you through some authenticity sort of exercises to try and develop your insight, etc., and your tools in which to become a little bit more authentic, right? But they see it as a journey. There's no sort of go to a half-day workshop or a half-hour, 45-minute session and become the full bottle. It's not about that. But it is about always going back, in between a session, is go back and check with someone on your team who you trust, or a colleague or a peer, whatever, and get their feedback. I just want to go through, I think, the last couple of slides.
Hang on. Just stop pushing the button.
Sorry, my dear.
Okay, so it is suggesting that you get feedback from others. I think particularly people who you respect and trust and who you feel will be honest and straightforward.
Just to be clear on that, so that's not waiting for the 360. So you do your self-assessment, we'll get the self-assessment.
You can go and
Now
have a
we
conversation.
have individual.
Yeah, that's a suggestion. And the self-rating gives you a sense of getting some feedback from others and saying, am I right in this? You know,
You
just
just
get
use
back.
the questions in the report.
Yep. And so the other thing though is that they do offer the 180 and the 360. But look, you'll find in your self-report that you'll get feedback tips and techniques. And again, it's just encouraging you to begin the journey, particularly if you're interested in this, because it's now been recognised globally that these are the, if you like, the skills of the future workforce. So that's why we're embedding it in our undergraduate and postgraduate programs. And by all means, check out other, there's Mesquite, there's a number of other different instruments that are around. But there is, I think, if this deck goes out, you can contact GENOS directly. And look, Mike and I have done as good as we can, being non-GENOS people, to represent them. But I'd love us to have Ben Palmer down one day, because he'll come down from Sydney to be able to sort of run a workshop with you, and you can absolutely take him to town in terms of any questions.
Great, we'll make
Thank
sure
you.
that the presentation is sent out and that people indeed can go to support@genosinternational.com. Can you put your hands together, please?